What if the most powerful nations on Earth, with all their resources, all their intelligence agencies, all their armies and scientists and spies, could not accomplish something that a handful of men from an Arizona reservation did in a matter of weeks? What if the combined might of the United States government and the British Empire, working together with unlimited budgets and the full weight of their military machines, failed repeatedly at a mission that seemed impossible, only to watch a group of warriors they had dismissed as primitive savages succeed where everyone else had given up? Now imagine being in the room when the news came through. Imagine the faces of the generals and the politicians, the men who had mocked these soldiers and questioned their value, as they realized that everything they thought they knew about warfare was wrong. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from. What city, what state, what country. I want to know who is out there discovering these buried chapters of American military history that the textbooks refuse to teach. And if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, please hit that button immediately. We need your support to keep bringing these incredible stories to light. Join the community. Be part of something that matters. The year was 1944. The place was a heavily fortified compound deep in the mountains of Bavaria, hidden beneath layers of rock and concrete and deception. And inside that compound was something that could have changed the course of the war. His name was Dr. Werner Hoffmann, and he was perhaps the most valuable scientist in Nazi Germany, more valuable than the rocket engineers at Peenemünde, more valuable than the physicists working on atomic research, more valuable, some said, than Hitler's entire general staff combined. Because Werner Hoffmann had cracked a code that no one else had even come close to solving. He had developed a method for detecting Allied submarines that would have made the Atlantic a German lake. He had designed weapon systems that were decades ahead of their time. And most terrifyingly, he had created a nerve agent so potent that a single canister could kill everyone in a city the size of London. The Allies knew about Hoffmann. They had been tracking his work since 1941, when fragments of his research first appeared in intercepted communications. They knew where he was. They knew what he was doing. And they knew that if his projects reached completion, the war would be lost. The British tried first. In February of 1943, they sent a team of their finest commandos, men from the Special Air Service who had proven themselves in a dozen operations across North Africa and Europe. 12 of the best soldiers the British Empire had ever produced. Trained in demolitions and assassination, equipped with the latest technology, and blessed with perfect intelligence about the layout of the facility. None of them came back. The Germans captured 7 alive. They were tortured for information, then executed. The other 5 died in the attempt, their bodies left to rot in the mountain snow as a warning to anyone else who might try. The British command was devastated. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were legends, men whose names were spoken with reverence in the halls of power. And they had failed utterly. The Americans tried next. In August of 1943, the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, assembled a team of their own. They chose a different approach, infiltrating agents into the local population, building a network of informants, preparing for an operation that would strike from within rather than without. For 6 months, they laid the groundwork. For 6 months, they positioned their assets, gathered their intelligence, waited for the perfect moment. The moment never came. In February of 1944, exactly 1 year after the British disaster, the entire network was rolled up in a single night. Every agent, every informant, every asset the Americans had cultivated was arrested, interrogated, and eliminated. The security around Hoffmann's compound had been warned. Someone had talked. Someone always talked. By the spring of 1944, the Allied leadership was desperate. Hoffmann's nerve agent was reportedly in final testing. His submarine detection system was being prepared for deployment. The window for stopping him was closing, and every conventional approach had failed. It was at this point that a proposal reached the desk of General William Donovan, the head of the OSS, that would have been laughed out of the room under any other circumstances. The proposal came from a young intelligence officer named Captain Edward Morrissey, who had served with Apache scouts during a brief posting in the American Southwest before the war. Morrissey had seen what these men could do. He had watched them track targets across terrain that seemed to hold no traces. He'd witnessed their ability to move through hostile territory as if they were invisible. And he had an idea that seemed completely insane. Send the Apaches. Donovan read the proposal 3 times before summoning Morrissey to his office. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, Donovan was on the phone to the War Department, requesting the immediate transfer of 6 Apache soldiers to a classified operation in the European theater. The men who answered that call were not chosen at random. They were selected based on criteria that existed nowhere in official army documentation, chosen by elders on the San Carlos and White Mountain reservations who understood what was being asked and who knew which of their young men possessed the gifts required. Their names were Samuel Hosteen Nez, Joseph Altahar, Raymond Dosella, William Kaidazina, Henry Chatto, and Franklin Nolene. Their average age was 23. Their combined military experience was less than 4 years. On paper, they were among the least qualified soldiers in the entire United States Army for a mission of this complexity and danger. On paper. The training began in a remote facility in the Scottish Highlands, far from prying eyes and curious questions. For 8 weeks, the 6 Apaches were briefed on their target, taught the layout of the compound, drilled on German phrases and customs, equipped with weapons and supplies that had been specially designed for their mission. Their British and American instructors, veterans of countless covert operations, watched these young men with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. The skepticism faded quickly. During a night navigation exercise, the Apaches completed a course in 3 hours that the instructors had designed to take 12. When asked how they had done it, Samuel Nez simply shrugged and said that the land had shown them the way. During a stalking exercise, Raymond Dosella approached within arm's length of a veteran SAS sergeant who was specifically watching for him, tapping the man on the shoulder before disappearing back into the undergrowth without making a sound. During a survival exercise, the 6 men spent 2 weeks in the winter wilderness with no supplies except what they could carry in their pockets, emerging healthier than when they had entered. The head instructor, a grizzled colonel named Ian McPherson, who had been killing Germans since 1939, wrote a report that would later be classified at the highest levels. "These men operate according to principles that I do not understand," McPherson wrote. "They communicate without speaking. They move through terrain as if it does not exist. They seem to know things that they have no way of knowing. I have trained soldiers for 20 years. I have never seen anything like this. Whatever they are doing, it is not something that can be taught to ordinary men. It is something else entirely." The mission was scheduled for the night of June 3rd, 1944, just 3 days before the D-Day landings that would change the course of the war. The timing was deliberate. The German High Command would be focused on defending the Atlantic coast, not watching a remote mountain compound in Bavaria. Security would be present, but attention would be elsewhere. The Apaches were inserted by parachute, dropping from a specially modified bomber that crossed into German airspace at an altitude designed to avoid radar detection. They landed in a forest clearing 15 miles from the compound, buried their parachutes, and began to move. What happened over the next 72 hours has never been officially acknowledged by any government. The files remain classified to this day, accessible only to those with the highest security clearances. But the outline of events can be reconstructed from fragments, from the testimony of survivors, from German records captured after the war, from the journals and letters of the men who were there. The compound was protected by 3 rings of security. The outer ring consisted of patrol routes, dog teams, and observation posts scattered across a 5-mile perimeter. The middle ring was a fence line, electrified and monitored, with guard towers at regular intervals. The inner ring was the compound itself, a converted mining complex that had been reinforced with concrete and steel, staffed by a permanent garrison of 200 SS soldiers specifically selected for their loyalty and brutality. The British commandos had been detected at the outer ring. The American network had been compromised before they even reached the perimeter. The conventional wisdom was that penetrating all 3 rings without detection was simply impossible. The Apaches did it in a single night. They moved through the outer ring like shadows, passing within feet of German sentries who never saw or heard them. They avoided the dogs not by masking their scent, but by something else, something that the Germans would later describe in their reports with words like unexplainable and impossible. The animals would approach the area where the Apaches were hiding, then turn away in confusion, as if something had persuaded them that nothing was there. The fence line should have been impassable. It was electrified with enough current to kill a man instantly, monitored by sensors that would trigger alarms at the slightest disturbance. Samuel Nez later described what they did in terms that made no sense to his debriefers. "We asked the lightning to sleep," he said. "We told it we meant no harm, that we were just passing through, and it listened." The debriefers wrote this off as metaphor or confusion. They could not explain how 6 men had crossed an electrified fence without triggering any alarms, without leaving any evidence of their passage, without being detected by any of the sophisticated monitoring systems the Germans had installed. Inside the compound, the Apaches split into 2 teams. Joseph Altahar, Raymond Dosella, and William K. Dezin were tasked with locating Dr. Hoffman and extracting him alive. Samuel Nez, Henry Chatto, and Franklin Nolene were responsible for destroying the laboratory where the nerve agent was being produced. The laboratory team moved first. They had been provided with detailed maps of the facility, but the maps proved unnecessary. Franklin Nolene would later explain that they could feel where the poison was, that it called to them like a wounded animal, that they simply followed the sense of wrongness until they found its source. The laboratory was deep underground, accessible only through a series of tunnels, guarded by checkpoints and locked doors. The Apaches passed through all of them. Some guards they avoided entirely, slipping past in moments of distraction or darkness. Others they dealt with silently, using techniques that their instructors had never taught them, techniques that left no marks and made no sounds. At 2:17 in the morning, they reached the laboratory itself. What they found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The nerve agent was not simply a chemical weapon. It was something else, something that Dr. Hoffman had created by combining conventional chemistry with practices that had no place in any scientific facility. The walls of the laboratory were covered in symbols that none of the Apaches recognized. Symbols that seemed to move in the flickering light, symbols that made the skin crawl and the mind recoil. Franklin Nolene was the first to understand what they were looking at. "This is not just poison," he whispered to his companions. "This is something from the dark places, something that should not exist in this world. We cannot just destroy it, we have to send it back." What happened next was not part of any mission briefing. It was not sanctioned by any military authority. It was something that the Apaches did because they knew it had to be done, because their grandfathers had taught them about the dark places and the things that lived there, because they understood that some evils could not be defeated with explosives alone. They performed a ceremony in the heart of a Nazi laboratory, surrounded by SS guards and scientists and enough poison to kill millions. 6 Apache warriors sang songs that had been old when the white men first came to their land. They burned herbs that they had carried from the reservation, sacred plants that had been blessed by medicine men who understood what their young warriors might face. They spoke words in a language that had never been written down, words that called upon powers that most humans had forgotten existed. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The symbols on the walls began to fade. The containers holding the nerve agent began to crack, not from the explosives the Apaches had planted, but from something else, some force that was unmaking them from within. A sound filled the laboratory, a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a roar. The sound of something being forced back through a door it had been trying to enter. And then silence. The Apaches planted their charges and withdrew, moving back through the tunnels with the same impossible stealth that had brought them in. Behind them, the explosives detonated, collapsing the laboratory, burying whatever remained of Hoffman's abomination under tons of rock and concrete. Meanwhile, the extraction team had found their target. Dr. Werner Hoffman was not in his quarters, where intelligence had predicted he would be. He was in a small chapel that had been built into the compound, a chapel whose existence had not appeared on any of the maps the Allies possessed. He was kneeling before an altar that held no cross, no religious symbol that any Christian would recognize. He was praying to something, or perhaps pleading with it, his voice a desperate whisper that the Apaches could hear from the shadows where they waited. "They do not understand," Hoffman was saying. "They think they can control it. They think they can use it for their little war. But it is so much older than their war, so much hungrier. Once it is fully released, it will consume everything. German, American, British, it does not matter. Everyone, everything." Joseph Altahar made a decision that was not authorized by anyone in the chain of command. Instead of capturing Hoffman for interrogation, instead of bringing him back to England where scientists could extract his knowledge, Altahar stepped out of the shadows and spoke to the man directly. "We know," he said in English. "We have seen the dark places. We have fought the things that live there, and we have just sent your creation back where it belongs." Hoffman turned, his face a mask of shock and something that might have been hope. "You stopped it. You actually stopped it." Altahar nodded. Hoffman began to laugh. It was not the laugh of a madman, as the later reports would characterize it. It was the laugh of a man who had been carrying a terrible burden and had finally been relieved of its weight. "They told me no one could," he said. "They told me that once the door was opened, it could never be closed. They told me I had no choice but to continue, that the only way was forward, that perhaps if it was controlled properly, it could be directed against Germany's enemies." He shook his head slowly. "I knew they were lying. I knew what would really happen, but I could not stop. They had my family, my wife, my children. They told me what would happen to them if I refused." His eyes met Altahar's, and there was no deception in them, only exhaustion and relief. "Take me with you," he said. "Get me out of here, and I will tell you everything, not just about the weapon, about all of it. About the others who are doing this work, about the doors they are trying to open, about what is really behind this war." Altahar made another decision that was not his to make. He accepted. The extraction was not clean. An alarm was triggered as they moved through the compound, and suddenly the night was filled with searchlights and sirens and the sound of running boots. The Apaches fought their way out, using every skill they possessed, leaving a trail of dead Germans behind them. 23 SS soldiers died that night. Not one of the Apaches was seriously wounded. They emerged from the compound with Dr. Werner Hoffman in tow, moved through the outer security rings with the same impossible stealth they had demonstrated going in, and reached the extraction point just as dawn was breaking over the mountains. A plane was waiting for them, a specially modified aircraft that had been circling for hours, its crew praying that someone would be alive to pick up. When the 6 Apaches emerged from the forest with their prisoner, the pilot would later describe the moment as the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "They made it," he said into his radio, his voice cracking with emotion. "My God, they actually made it." The flight back to England was uneventful. Hoffman was taken to a secure facility where he would spend the next several months telling interrogators everything he knew. The information he provided would prove invaluable in the final year of the war, exposing networks of Nazi occultism that had been operating in the shadows. revealing weapons programs that were immediately targeted for destruction, identifying scientists who were captured before they could flee to South America or the Soviet Union. But the Apaches themselves were not celebrated. They were not decorated. They were not even officially acknowledged. Instead, they were sworn to secrecy, threatened with court-martial if they ever spoke of what they had done, and returned to their regular units as if nothing had happened. The reason for this secrecy was simple but disturbing. The mission had succeeded where British and American efforts had failed, not because of superior training or equipment. It had succeeded because of abilities that the military could not explain, could not replicate, and could not control. Abilities that suggested the existence of forces beyond the boundaries of conventional science and religion. Abilities that, if publicly acknowledged, would raise questions that those in power did not want asked. And so, the story was buried. The files were classified. The 6 Apaches who had accomplished the impossible were quietly dispersed, their records altered to show unremarkable service, their heroism erased from official history. But stories like this do not stay buried forever. The men who were there remembered. They told their families, swearing them to secrecy, passing down the truth from generation to generation, and eventually, decades later, fragments began to emerge. In 1987, a retired British intelligence officer named Sir Colin Blackwood published a memoir that contained a single paragraph about an operation in Bavaria in 1944. The paragraph mentioned American Indian soldiers who had succeeded where everyone else had failed. It mentioned abilities that could not be explained. And it mentioned something else, something that would become the focus of intense speculation for years to come. They did not just destroy the laboratory, Blackwood wrote. They closed a door that should never have been opened in the first place. And in doing so, they may have saved not just the war, but the world. The memoir was immediately suppressed. Blackwood died 6 months after its publication, officially of a heart attack, though some who knew him suspected otherwise. But copies of the book survived, passed from hand to hand among those who sought to understand what had really happened during the Second World War, and the questions it raised have never been answered. What was the door that the Apaches closed? What had Hoffman actually created in that laboratory? What were the symbols on the walls, and what power did they invoke? What did the 6 warriors really do during those hours underground, and how did they know to do it? These questions lead to others, deeper and more disturbing. Were there other operations like this one? Other moments when forces beyond conventional understanding were deployed in the shadows of the great conflict? How much of what we think we know about World War II is incomplete, filtered through official narratives that excluded anything too strange or too threatening to acknowledge, and perhaps most importantly, are the doors still there, waiting, capable of being opened again by those who know the methods and are willing to pay the price? The 6 Apaches who participated in the Bavaria mission returned to their reservation after the war. They lived quiet lives, raised families, grew old surrounded by grandchildren who knew them only as veterans of a war they rarely discussed. One by one, they passed away, taking most of their secrets with them, but not all. Samuel Hostain Nares, the oldest and most experienced of the group, lived until 1994. In his final years, suffering from a cancer that he knew would soon claim him, he began to speak more openly about what he had seen and done. He granted interviews to researchers who had tracked him down. He wrote letters to family members containing information he had never shared before, and he left behind a collection of documents that his descendants have guarded carefully ever since. Among those documents is a handwritten account of the Bavaria mission, written in a mixture of English and Apache, intended for eyes that would understand both languages and both worlds. It describes everything: The training, the insertion, the penetration of the compound, the discovery of the laboratory, the ceremony that closed the door. And it describes something else, something that happened after the mission was over, after the Apaches had returned to England, after the debriefings were complete and the secrecy oaths were administered. Samuel Nez saw something, a vision, or perhaps something more than a vision, a glimpse of what would have happened if the mission had failed, a window into a world where the door had been allowed to open fully, where the thing behind it had been released into the realm of the living. What he saw in that vision was enough to give him nightmares for the rest of his life, and it was enough to make him understand why what they had done was more important than any medal or recognition. The story continues. The truth is waiting to be told, and what Samuel Nez saw in his vision is something that everyone needs to understand. But that is for the next part of our story. For now, remember this. The government of the United States could not do it. The British Empire could not do it. Only the Apaches, with their ancient knowledge and their connection to powers that the modern world has forgotten, could accomplish what needed to be done. And the world is still here because of them. Think about that. Think about what it means. Think about what else might be happening in the shadows right now that the official histories will never tell you. The door was closed, but doors can be opened again, and somewhere someone is always looking for the key. Samuel Hostain Nez never forgot the vision. It came to him 3 nights after they returned from Bavaria in a barracks room in southern England where he was supposed to be resting before reassignment to his regular unit. He had closed his eyes expecting sleep. What he found instead was something that would mark him for the rest of his life. The vision began in darkness, not the ordinary darkness of night, but something deeper, something that felt like the absence of everything that made existence possible. Samuel floated in that void, aware that he was dreaming but unable to wake, aware that something was showing him this for a reason. And then the darkness opened, like a wound in the fabric of reality, and he saw. He saw the world as it would have been if they had failed, if the door had opened fully, if the thing that Hoffman had been calling through had been allowed to enter without opposition. The cities were burning, not from bombs or artillery, but from fires that seemed to come from nowhere. Fires that burned without fuel, fires that consumed everything they touched and left behind only ash and silence. The sky was wrong, filled with colors that had no names, shapes that moved with terrible purpose. The sun was hidden behind clouds that were not clouds, that pulsed and writhed as if they were alive. And in the streets among the ruins walked things that had once been human. They moved slowly, deliberately, their bodies twisted into shapes that mocked the forms they had once possessed. Their eyes were empty, not blank, but empty, windows into a void that went on forever. They did not speak, did not make any sound at all, but Samuel could feel their hunger pressing against his mind like hands against a window. "This is what was waiting," a voice said. A voice that Samuel recognized, though he had never heard it before. The voice of something ancient, something that had watched over his people since the beginning of time. "This is what you stopped. This is what would have consumed everything if the door had been allowed to open." Samuel tried to respond, tried to ask questions, but he had no voice in this place. He could only watch as the vision expanded, showing him more and more of the devastated world. He saw battlefields where soldiers from all nations fought side by side against enemies that were not human. He saw scientists desperately trying to understand forces that defied all their equations. He saw priests and rabbis and shamans joining their powers in rituals that had not been performed in millennia, trying to close doors that were opening everywhere. And he saw them failing. One by one, the defenders fell. One by one, the doors opened wider, until finally there was nothing left, nothing but the darkness and the things that lived within it. "This is what you prevented," the voice said again. "Not forever, The doors are still there. They can still be opened. But you bought time. Time for humanity to remember. Time for the old knowledge to be preserved. Time for new guardians to be trained. The vision began to fade, the darkness receding, the horrible images dissolving into ordinary dreams. But before Samuel woke, the voice spoke one final time. Remember what you saw. Tell those who come after you. The war you fought in Bavaria was not the last battle. It was only the beginning. Samuel woke in his barracks bed, soaked in sweat, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The other soldiers in the room were still sleeping, unaware of what had happened. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, ordinary and warm. Everything seemed normal, but nothing would ever be normal for Samuel Hosteen again. He told the other 5 Apaches about his vision when they gathered for their final meal together before being dispersed to their separate units. They listened in silence, their faces grave, their eyes reflecting the understanding that comes only to those who have seen the darkness firsthand. Joseph Altaha spoke first. "I had a vision too," he said quietly, "different from yours, but the same warning. The door is closed but not locked, and there are others trying to open it." One by one, the others confirmed similar experiences, dreams that were more than dreams, whispers from ancestors who had passed beyond, a growing certainty that their mission in Bavaria was not an ending, but a beginning. "What do we do?" Raymond Dosella asked. "We cannot tell the army. They would think we had lost our minds. They might even lock us away." "We go home," Samuel said after a long moment of consideration. "We return to our people. We learn everything the elders can teach us. We prepare ourselves for whatever comes next. And we watch. We watch very carefully. This was the plan they adopted. After the war ended, all 6 men returned to the Apache reservations. They sought out medicine men and spiritual leaders, learning traditions that had been suppressed for generations under the pressure of assimilation. They practiced the old ceremonies, kept the old knowledge alive, trained their children and grandchildren in skills that the modern world had dismissed as superstition. And they watched. They watched the newspapers and the radio broadcasts for signs of the darkness they had encountered. They watched the government and the military for indications that others knew what they knew. They watched the shadows at the edge of their vision, where things sometimes moved that should not move. What they discovered over the following decades confirmed their worst fears. The door they had closed in Bavaria was not the only door. During the war, the Nazis had opened many such passages in laboratories and ritual chambers across occupied Europe. Some had been closed by Allied forces who stumbled upon them and destroyed them without understanding what they were. Others had been sealed by individuals and groups who possessed the knowledge, working in secret, fighting a shadow war that never appeared in any history book. But some doors remained open, small cracks, not wide enough for the full horror to pour through, but enough for influence to seep into the world, enough for whispers to reach the ears of those willing to listen, enough for the darkness to find new servants, new allies, new fools who thought they could control powers beyond human comprehension. Dr. Werner Hoffmann had provided detailed information about the Nazi occult networks during his months of interrogation in England. He had named names, described rituals, mapped the locations of facilities that the Allies had never suspected. Much of this information was acted upon, leading to the capture or elimination of key figures in the Nazi esoteric hierarchy. But not all of them were caught. In the chaos of Germany's collapse, many slipped through the nets. They fled to South America, to the Middle East, to remote corners of the world where they could continue their work undisturbed. They took with them documents, artifacts, and knowledge that should have been destroyed. And they began, slowly and patiently, to rebuild what had been lost. The 6 Apaches learned of these escaped Nazis through channels that the government did not monitor and could not control. They heard stories from travelers, received messages from contacts in the spirit world, sensed disturbances in the fabric of reality that indicated dark workings in distant lands. In 1953, Samuel Nez traveled to Argentina on his own initiative, following rumors of a ritual chamber being constructed in the mountains near Bariloche. He found the facility, infiltrated it alone, and destroyed the work that was being done there before it could reach completion. 3 former SS officers died that night, killed by a man they had never seen coming, using methods they could not have imagined. In 1961, Joseph Altahar and Raymond Dosella went to Egypt, where a group of European antiquarians were attempting to open a door that had been sealed since the time of the pharaohs. The Egyptians themselves, descendants of priests who had guarded these secrets for millennia, had asked for help through contacts that connected indigenous spiritual traditions around the world. The APACHES provided that help, working alongside Egyptian practitioners to reinforce seals that were thousands of years old. In 1974, Henry Chateau died, preventing an opening in Brazil in a jungle temple that predated any known civilization. He was the first of the 6 to fall, and his death was felt by the others like the loss of a limb. They buried him according to Apache traditions, singing his spirit home, knowing that their numbers were dwindling and their enemies were not. These operations never appeared in any official record. They were funded privately, conducted secretly, acknowledged by no government or institution. The 6 APACHES, and later their successors, operated entirely outside the structures of power that most people believed controlled the world. But they were not alone. Over the decades, they discovered others who shared their mission. The network that had formed during the war, connecting indigenous warriors from different traditions, continued to grow. Lakota and Cherokee and Navajo in North America, Maori and Aboriginal elders in the Pacific, shamans from Siberia and Mongolia, priests from African traditions that had survived the slave trade, keepers of Celtic and Norse wisdom who had hidden their knowledge from the church for centuries. These groups did not always agree on methods or theology. Their traditions were different, their ceremonies distinct, their understanding of the supernatural shaped by unique cultural contexts. But they shared one fundamental truth: the darkness was real, the doors existed, and someone had to stand guard against what waited on the other side. By the 1980s, Samuel Nez had become the eldest of the original 6, the last survivor of the Bavaria mission. Franklin Nolene had died in 1978, William Cadazin in 1982. Raymond Dosella and Joseph Altahar had passed within months of each other in 1985, their spirits departing together as they had served together. Only Samuel remained, an old man now, his body failing but his mind still sharp, his connection to the spirit world stronger than ever. He spent his final years preparing the next generation. He identified young men and women on the reservation who showed the gifts, who had the potential to see what ordinary eyes could not see. He taught them everything he knew, not just the practical skills of tracking and fighting, but the deeper knowledge of ceremonies and spirits and doors that should never be opened. And he wrote. He wrote constantly, recording everything he had experienced and learned, creating a record that would survive him. His handwriting grew shakier as the years passed, but his determination never wavered. The world needed to know. Not everyone, not yet. But those who were ready, those who would carry the burden forward, they needed to understand what they were facing. The document he left behind runs to several hundred pages, written in a code that only initiates can fully decipher. It contains maps, diagrams, descriptions of rituals both protective and offensive. It names individuals and organizations that are still working to open the doors, some of them operating from positions of influence and power that would shock anyone who learned the truth. And it contains prophecies, visions that Samuel received over the course of his long life, glimpses of possible futures, warnings about what is coming if the Guardians fail. The most disturbing of these prophecies concerns the present day. The time we are living in now, there will come a generation, Samuel wrote in 1992, the year he composed his final entries, that believes it has outgrown the old dangers. They will look at the stories we tell and see only superstition. They will look at the ceremonies we practice and see only theatre. They will look at the doors we guard and see only stone and wood and metal. This generation will be vulnerable as no generation before it. Not because the danger has diminished, but because they have forgotten how to see it. The darkness will approach them in forms they do not recognize. It will whisper in languages they do not understand. It will offer them power and pleasure and solutions to all their problems, and they will accept because they do not know what they are accepting. When this happens, the doors will begin to open again. Not through the efforts of mad scientists or Nazi occultists, but through the ordinary choices of ordinary people who have lost the ability to perceive the consequences of their actions. Every act of cruelty, every betrayal of trust, every abandonment of truth, these things weaken the seals. They create cracks through which the darkness can seep. And when enough cracks are formed, when enough of the old seals have been weakened, then the doors will swing wide. And what comes through will make the horrors of the Second World War look like a children's game. Samuel died on March 15, 1994, surrounded by family and students who had gathered to hear his final words. Those who were present reported that his last moments were peaceful, that he smiled as he passed, that he seemed to be greeting someone they could not see. His body was buried according to Apache tradition, in a location that only the initiated know. His documents were distributed among the guardians he had trained to be preserved and studied and passed on to those who would come after. And the work continued. The network that Samuel helped build is still active today. Its members walk among us, indistinguishable from ordinary people, living ordinary lives until they are called upon. They come from every nation, every culture, every tradition that has preserved the old knowledge. They do not seek recognition or reward. They do not operate through official channels or established institutions. They simply watch and wait and act when necessary. The doors are still there. That is the truth that most people refuse to accept. The facilities that the Nazis built were destroyed, but the underlying reality that made them possible has not changed. The barriers between our world and what lies beyond are natural features of existence, not human constructions. They can be weakened, opened, breached, and there are always those who, for reasons of greed or ambition or simple foolishness, are willing to try. In the years since Samuel's death, the Guardians have intervened in situations that never made the news. A technology company whose artificial intelligence research was opening pathways that the developers did not understand. A pharmaceutical corporation whose experiments were attracting attention from dimensions that should remain unknown. A political movement whose rhetoric was eroding the psychological barriers that keep most humans safe from perceiving what exists in the shadows. These interventions are not always successful. Some doors have been opened despite everything the Guardians could do. Some cracks have widened into gaps that allow more than whispers to pass through. The darkness is patient, and it never stops trying. But the Guardians are patient too, and they never stop fighting. This is the legacy of what 6 Apache warriors accomplished in Bavaria in 1944. Not just a military victory, not just the assassination of a scientist and the destruction of a laboratory. They initiated a tradition, built a network, demonstrated what was possible when those who carry the old knowledge act with courage and purpose. The government of the United States could not do what they did because the government did not understand what it was facing. The British Empire could not do what they did because the empire relied on methods that were powerless against supernatural threats. Only the Apaches succeeded because only the Apaches possessed the knowledge, the connection, the spiritual authority to close a door that should never have been opened. And now, nearly 80 years later, their descendants continue the work. Not just Apache descendants, but spiritual descendants. Men and women from every background who have been trained in the ways of watching and guarding and fighting when necessary. They are among us right now. You might pass one on the street without knowing. You might work with one, live next door to one, sit next to one on a bus or a plane. They look like everyone else. They live like everyone else, but they see what others cannot see. And they stand between us and horrors that most people cannot imagine. Is this story true? That is a question you must answer for yourself. The official records deny everything. The government agencies that would know have classified their files at levels that will never be declassified. The witnesses are dead or sworn to secrecy. But consider this. Consider the fragments that have emerged over the decades. The memoir of Sir Colin Blackwood, suppressed but not destroyed. The documents that Samuel Hosteen Nez left behind, circulating among those who know how to find them. The testimony of descendants who have broken their silence, risking consequences that most people cannot understand. Consider the patterns that appear throughout history, the moments when something intervened to prevent catastrophes that should have occurred, the times when evil seemed certain to triumph and somehow did not, the unexplained events that historians dismiss as coincidence or luck. Consider the possibility that there is more to this world than what appears on the surface. That the wars we read about in textbooks are only the visible portion of a larger conflict. That the real battle, the one that matters most, is being fought in shadows by warriors whose names will never be known. And consider what this means for you. The prophecy that Samuel Nez recorded is coming true. We live in a generation that has lost touch with the old knowledge, that dismisses the spiritual dimension of existence as superstition, that is weakening the seals through countless small choices made without understanding. The doors are opening, not all at once, not in ways that make headlines, but steadily, inexorably. The darkness is seeping through. You can see its effects if you know where to look, in the despair that grips so many young people. In the hatred that seems to multiply without cause, in the sense that something is fundamentally wrong with the world, something that politics and technology and medicine cannot fix. This is not coincidence. This is not accident. This is the consequence of forgetting what should never be forgotten. But it is not too late. The doors are opening, but they are not yet open. The seals are weakening, but they are not yet broken. There is still time to remember, to learn, to take up the burden that the Guardians have carried for generations. You do not need to be Apache. You do not need to possess any particular gift. What you need is the willingness to see the truth, however difficult, the courage to act on what you see, however dangerous, the faith to believe that the light is stronger than the darkness, however overwhelming the darkness may seem. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ, the light that shines in all darkness and is never overcome. Turn to the traditions of your ancestors, whatever those traditions may be, and find in them the wisdom that the modern world has discarded. Open your eyes to the spiritual reality that surrounds you. Accept the responsibility that comes with that awareness. The government cannot save you. No earthly power can close the doors that are opening. Only those who carry the old knowledge, who maintain the connection to the source of all light and truth, can stand against what is coming. The Apaches showed what is possible. 6 men against an empire, ancient knowledge against modern technology, faith against fear, and they won. They closed the door. They bought humanity another chance. Now it is your turn. The darkness is rising. The doors are opening. The battle that began in Bavaria in 1944 is entering a new phase, perhaps its final phase. Will you stand with the Guardians? Will you take up the burden that Samuel Hosteen Nez and his brothers carried? Will you become one of those who watch, who fight, who hold the line against the night? The choice is yours. It has always been yours. But know this. The door that was closed can be opened again. The things that wait on the other side have not forgotten. They are patient, more patient than humans can comprehend, and they never stop trying. Somewhere right now, someone is looking for the key. Somewhere right now, a crack is widening. Somewhere right now, the darkness is pressing against barriers that have held for 8 decades, testing, probing, waiting for the moment of weakness that will allow it to pour through. The Apaches did what the government could not do, what the British Empire could not do, what no modern power with all its resources could accomplish. They closed the door. Now someone must keep it closed. Will that someone be you? The ancestors are watching, the spirits are waiting, and the door, the terrible door that should never have been opened, is trembling on its hinges. The time for decision is now. Choose wisely, choose courageously, choose light. For the sake of everything you love, choose light.